If you have at least 1 year of skilled work in Canada, you might qualify for permanent residence in the Canadian Experience class. And in this episode, I'm going to break down exactly what you need to qualify for permanent residence in this program. I'm Brooke. I'm a Canadian immigration expert and founder of Navio. At Navio, we offer expert immigration advice without the law firm price tag. And in this episode, I'm going to walk you through the Canadian Experience class eligibility criteria, including the nuance and lesser known interpretations of the rules that IRCC has confirmed in access to information and privacy requests, immigration representative emails, and case law. This is the first part in a 3-part series. By the end of this episode, you'll know exactly how and when you qualify. And in the next 2 episodes, I will walk you through creating an express entry profile that's optimized for Canadian Experience class and gathering the documents you need to prepare a successful application. Canadian Experience class is one of the main permanent residence programs in Canada that's managed through the express entry system, alongside the Federal Skilled Worker Program and the Federal Skilled Trades Program. It's designed for people who have already accumulated a year of skilled work in Canada, and IRCC has made it clear that over the next 3 years, these are people that the immigration system is going to prioritize. So if you already meet the requirements, or when you do, it's incredibly beneficial to create an express entry profile and take advantage of IRCC's emphasis and favorability toward people who have already gained work experience in Canada and contributed to building Canada's economy. There's a really important distinction to make between CEC eligibility criteria, which are the minimum requirements you have to meet in order to take the first step in your immigration journey. And the second point is actually becoming a permanent resident, because meeting the criteria doesn't guarantee you'll become a PR. You actually, once you meet the eligibility criteria, you need an invitation to apply in the express entry system before you can proceed with your application and potentially become a permanent resident. And in this video, I'm covering eligibility criteria only. In the next videos, I'll explain the express entry system, how to create your profile and maximize your points so you have the highest chance possible of getting an invitation to apply. And our third video in the series will cover the documents you need to submit once you have an ITA to ensure that your application passes completeness and to make sure that you're as likely as possible to get that approval. On the surface, the CEC eligibility criteria seem pretty straightforward, but there's some key nuances that you need to understand in order to succeed. And we're going to cover those in this episode. So first things first, the 3 main eligibility criteria. The first is that you have at least a year of skilled work experience in Canada, and that experience must be gained within the 3 years before you apply for PR. The next is that you meet the minimum language requirement, and that's going to depend on the skill level of your work experience. So if your experience was gained in an occupation that is tier 0 or 1, you need to score CLB 7 or higher in each of the language testing areas. And if your experience was in tier 2 or 3, then you need to score at least CLB 5 in each language testing area. And the last criteria is that you intend to reside outside of Quebec. If you're residing in Quebec and you'd like to stay in the province, then you'll need to apply directly to the Quebec immigration programs. Now let's dive deeper into each of those requirements. As I mentioned, the work experience must be at least 1 year in a skilled occupation, and that is any work experience that falls into tier 0, 1, 2, or 3. Any work experience that you gained in Canada that's in tier 4 or 5 is semi-skilled or entry-level experience that does not count towards your eligibility in the Canadian Experience class. Full-time work experience is defined as 30 hours per week for the purpose of this program, which totals 1,560 hours when you work 12 months or 52 weeks. And you have to meet both. So you need the hours, 1,560, and you need at least 52 weeks of work. You can't work more than 30 hours and gain 1,560 hours in less than 12 months to qualify. So if you are working more than 30 hours a week, you not only need to hit the 1,560 hour test, but you also need to physically work at least 52 weeks. And that work experience can be cumulative, so it does not need to be 1 year consecutively. It can also be for multiple employers in multiple occupations, as long as the occupations are all skilled. So for example, you could work 6 months as a supervisor and another 6 months as a manager. Perhaps one is a retail supervisor and the other is a restaurant manager. You can mix and match as long as each period of employment meets the program requirements. And if you are mixing and matching multiple occupations and those occupations span different tiers, then just be aware that the language requirement you have to satisfy depends on the tier of the occupation in which you worked the most amount of time. So the example I gave you was 6 months and 6 months, but let's say you work 8 months as a supervisor, which is tier 2 or 3, depending on the type of supervisor, and then you work another 4 months as a manager. Since your majority of your work experience is in tier 2 or 3, then you have to hit at least CLB 5. But if the reverse were true, and 8 of the 12 months was in a tier 0 or 1 occupation, then you'd have to hit CLB 7 in all the language test areas. Now, ultimately, that nuance is a bit irrelevant because we know based on who's getting invited in Express Entry that you need higher than the minimum requirement to get an invitation to apply. But I don't want to deter anyone who meets the minimum requirement from creating an Express Entry profile, because with the latest immigration levels plan, we know that IRCC is planning a fast track to permanent residence for in Canada applicants with Canadian experience. And we know that IRCC is prioritizing Canadian experience class applicants. So we never know who's going to get invited to apply. On a balance of probabilities, if you meet the bare minimum requirements, you're not highly likely to get invited, but we never know. So if you do meet the minimum, then create a profile. There's no fee to create the profile. The only expenses you would incur are your language test results at a minimum and probably an education credential assessment. So those combined would be about $600 Canadian, and that's about the investment that you're looking at making just to create your Express Entry profile. So just to recap, hours alone aren't enough. You also need the period of time employed, and work experience can be spread over multiple employers, multiple occupations, as long as they're all skilled. And it's a cumulative calculation in the 3 years prior to applying. So that 3-year window, it does shift depending on when you get your invitation to apply. So if you have work experience that's nearing that the end of the 3-year window, just be mindful of that. And if you can, continue working so that any experience that starts to fall outside the 3-year window is being replaced with new work experience. You can also count part-time work experience. That could be working 2 part-time jobs at the same time, again, for a 12-month period, or 1 part-time job that you work for a period of 2 years. I want to dive a little deeper into confirming that your work experience is within a NOC code that's tier 0 through 3. Having the job title isn't enough. You need to prove that you've performed the work in the lead statement of the NOC, as well as a majority of the duties listed under the main duties. One example that I see commonly mixed up is the difference between a supervisor and a manager, or an assistant manager and a supervisor. And I've seen this in the food service industry, in retail, where someone in title is an assistant manager, but when we compare their duties against the NOC, it actually aligns more closely with the supervisor. And there's no harm in aligning an assistant manager position with the supervisory NOC, because both supervisor and manager are skilled occupations. So for the purpose of meeting the eligibility criteria, which is just pass fail, both suffice. And it's better to align with the NOC appropriately. It doesn't mean you need to change the job title, but selecting the NOC in your Express Entry profile that aligns most closely with the duties you actually performed versus with your job title. Here I'll show you an example. The National Occupational Classification System, or NOC, is what's used to categorize occupations by IRCC. You can search by job title or NOC code. And if I just search supervisor, for example, you'll see a list of occupations. So right here from the search results, you can see the tier level. And by clicking the job title, you'll be able to see the lead statement and the main duties. This here's the lead statement. So it must be representative, generally speaking, with the role that you performed. Next, you'll see example titles, but if you don't see your occupation or job title in this list, that's not the end of the world, because these are examples. It's not exhaustive, but you should also look in other NOC categories to see if you can find your job title, because it is a good indicator that it might be the right NOC code. But again, it's not determinative. Next, you have to perform a majority of the main duties listed here. And you will see that some of them start with may. These ones don't count. So if I start from the duties that begin with an adjective and not the word may, you must have performed a majority, so 51% or more, of the duties that I've highlighted here. Now, when it comes time to submitting your application, this is after you get an invitation to apply, you will need to provide proof of employment. And I'll go into this again in more detail in part 3 of our series, but it's worth mentioning now. Make sure you don't copy and paste the duties verbatim into your work experience letters. You need to adapt them so that they are tailored to your unique work experience while keeping them aligned with the duties listed here. Now, another good exercise is to look at the NOC code matrix for similar job titles, because IRCC puts the onus on you as the applicant to select the correct NOC code. And using the search function doesn't always yield the best results. So what I do is I use the search function to try and find relevant NOC codes as my first step. And once I found a NOC code that appears applicable, then I also look at the major and minor groups here so that I can, on the right-hand side, and then I can see what other categories I might want to explore. Coming back to that example of supervisor and manager, look at both. Read the lead statement of both categories, review the main duties, and maybe there are overlapping duties, and you might determine that you've done the majority of both of them. Choose the NOC code that has the most duties relevant to what you've done. And another note on the NOC code is that it's not necessary to meet the employment requirements that's listed in the NOC. That's not a requirement of the Canadian Experience class. That being said, if you are working in a regulated occupation, which is one where you would require a license, for example, a regulated Canadian immigration consultant, a dentist, a doctor, a teacher, then you have to have the requisite licensing. Otherwise, you're not actually qualified to do the job. But otherwise, you don't need to meet the criteria that are listed in the NOC code, such as the educational requirements. You'll see here completion of community college is required. If you have the experience, in this case, we're looking at food service supervisor. If you have the experience and you don't have the community college degree, then you're still able to use that experience to meet the criteria and be eligible in the CEC program. As I mentioned, once I've done my main search using the search tool, I look at the hierarchy and structure. This helps me explore other NOC codes that are related or perhaps similar that didn't come up in my search criteria. So we were looking at 6.2, food service supervisor, and here you can see other occupations that are similar or related. I can also look in 6.0 because that would be occupations that are more senior. And I could also look in 6, 4, and 5, which is a really good exercise because you want to make sure that you don't find another NOC code that is closely related to the experience you have that falls into 6.4, 6.5, anything where the second number is 4 and 5, because those are semi-skilled and entry level. They're not applicable. And if there is a NOC code that falls into tier 4 or 5 that's similar, you better make sure that you have really strong employer reference letters and additional evidence to make sure there's no room for the immigration officer to suggest or draw the conclusion that your work experience wasn't skilled. Finally, IRCC guidance permits a reasonable amount of vacation time within the 12-month period that will still count as eligible experience. So if you take off your 2 weeks of allotted vacation, that doesn't set you back 2 weeks from meeting the minimum eligibility criteria. But you can't squeeze the 1,560 hours into a shorter period and then just call the rest of the 12-month period vacation. It is very nuanced and every application is assessed on its own merit. Generally speaking, I err on the side of caution and conservatively say that a 2 to 3 week period of vacation is relatively safe to include in your 12-month calculation. Now, what doesn't count? Self-employed work doesn't count. Work while you're a full-time student or co-op work doesn't count. Work for a foreign employer while you're physically in Canada doesn't count. Work when you weren't authorized to work in Canada certainly doesn't count. It's important to establish that you were an employee of a Canadian company in order for the work experience to be eligible. Now, you could be working remotely from within Canada for a Canadian employer, and IRCC has confirmed that that is acceptable, but any remote work while in Canada for a foreign company or where payroll is administered outside Canada won't count. Additionally, as I mentioned, self-employment doesn't count, and this includes gig work and contract work. It's important to establish that you didn't have control over the work in terms of setting your schedule, and you weren't responsible for providing the tools needed to do your work, that you didn't have a significant ownership stake in the company. And if you have any concerns, you can actually refer to the Canada Revenue Agency guide on employee versus self-employed, and even go as far as requesting an opinion from the CRA. Now, that's not to say that all contract roles aren't eligible. For example, I've supported people who were called contractors on paper, but when we dug below the surface, we could see that their hours were set for them. They were required to come to an office that was provided by the employer. The tools needed to do their work were provided by the employer. They weren't allowed to subcontract their work. These factors are more important than the title itself. Volunteer and unpaid work also doesn't count. Now to criteria number 2, language. As I mentioned, the minimum language scores you need to attain depends on the skill level of the work experience you're using to prove your eligibility in the program. If the majority of your work experience falls into occupations that are tier 0 or 1, you need at least CLB 7 in all the language test areas. And if your work experience falls into tier 2 or 3, then you need at least CLB 5. Language tests have to be obtained from one of the IRCC recognized testing centers, and the results have to be at less than 2 years old. You also can't mix and match the scores from test results. So if you completed a test and didn't score as highly as you would like and completed a second test, you can't combine the different results. I've had cases where someone completed a test and scored really well in, say, 2 of the 4, so they completed the test again and then improved their scores in the 2 that they didn't do as well in the last time, but their scores in the other 2 actually went down, and you can't mix and match. So you can repeat the test as many times as you want. Of course, you have to pay every time. But once you get that test with the scores that you're satisfied with in each of the 4 testing areas, then you can use that single test. And something I recommend to all of my clients is if you're just shy of the scores that you would hope to attain, check out the testing center's policy on requesting review, because we've had a lot of success making that request for a review of the results. That typically doesn't come with the same cost as retaking the entire test. So I would start with that review process first if it's available. And if not, or if the results don't yield higher scores, then consider retaking the test. And the final requirement of the Canadian Experience class is that you intend to reside outside Quebec. If your work experience was gained in Quebec, that's okay. You can still count it, as long as you already have moved to another province or can show very strong evidence to prove that you will be relocating outside of Quebec. Again, if you do plan to stay within the province, then you need to apply to the Quebec provincial program. So to summarize, you're likely to qualify in the Canadian Experience class if you have 1,560 hours over a 12-month period working in an occupation or multiple occupations that fall within tier 0 through 3. The work was paid. It was in Canada for a Canadian employer. You scored CLB level 5 or 7 on the language test, depending on the skill level of the majority of your work, and you intend to reside outside Quebec. It's important to note that you don't require a job offer. You don't need to be currently working, because eligibility is based on experience that you've already gained, and you don't actually need to be physically in Canada if you've accumulated the work experience and meet the other requirements. You can technically be outside the country. The risk there is that if you start to lose work experience because it's falling outside that 3-year window, then you're not replenishing. So if you're in Canada and able to keep working, it ensures that any work experience that starts to expire is being replenished with current work experience. And if you don't qualify yet, you can gain work experience in Canada on a work permit. And if you need to extend a work permit or you need a new permit, or perhaps you're outside Canada looking to come and work and become eligible in the Canadian Experience class, you can check out our other episodes on ways to apply for work permits or extend your stay so that you can continue working in Canada. If you want to learn more, check out Navio HQ. It's your hub for everything Canadian immigration, built by our experts, and absolutely free for you. Inside, you'll find an eligibility assessment to help you determine if you meet the CEC criteria, as well as guides for creating your Express Entry profile and preparing your application, and templates for those work experience letters, which I know from supporting hundreds of people are one of the most stressful and nerve-wracking components of the applications. And stay tuned for parts 2 and 3 of this series that will walk you through creating your Express Entry profile optimized for CEC and preparing your documents when you get that coveted ITA. Thanks for joining.